Hey, welcome to Therapy by Gabby. I'm Gabby. I'm a licensed professional counselor practicing in the state of Wisconsin, and I talk about things for therapists, therapy goers, and about the mental health experience in general. If you're not already connected with me on my other socials, you should head over to my TikTok and Instagram, which are both at Therapy by Gabby. And if you're not already subscribed here, you should subscribe to my YouTube channel and turn on that notification bell so you can get notified every time I post a video. Let's dive into it. Today's video is going to be on my boundaries in my therapy private practice. I own and operate my own solo therapy private practice where I see clients, and yes, even your therapist has boundaries. In the context of therapy, your therapist's boundaries are their practice policies. So if you've ever had a first session with a therapist, you probably know that before you get started, they send you a bunch of paperwork for you to review and sign, and we call that the informed consent paperwork. And in that paperwork, there's a bunch of information about your rights as a patient, HIPAA, confidentiality, but it also includes your therapist practice policies, which outlines their boundaries, what they are willing to do and not willing to do in their practice, and what that looks like when you're working with them. So for this video, I'm going to use the language of boundaries and practice policies interchangeably, but I'm referencing the same thing. But let's start with, generally speaking, what is a boundary? Boundaries are when we inform the people around us, the people we are in relationships with, what we are willing to tolerate, not tolerate, what we need, what we request from them. And then we also inform them if those needs or requests are not met, or their behavior is something we cannot tolerate. We inform them of what the consequence of their behavior is. I think it can be helpful to think about sports when we talk about boundaries. Let's take basketball, for instance. Basketball has 4 lines that outline the basketball court. And in the 4 lines, we know that that is what is considered in bounds. Outside of the 4 lines is what we consider out of bounds. And so, for example, a rule in basketball is if you are dribbling the ball, you cannot step out of bounds. The boundary in basketball is if you're dribbling the ball and you step out of bounds, the referee is going to blow their whistle and the ball is going to go to the other team. So when the people in our life step out of bounds, it's our job to act as the referee, blow the whistle, and maintain the consequences of stepping out of bounds in our relationship. In the context of relationships, a rule we might have for other people is don't yell at me. A boundary that we have for other people is, I really want to talk to you on the phone, but if you continue to yell at me, I'm going to have to hang up the phone call. The only way a boundary can be a boundary is if we follow through with the consequence. If we don't, it's not a boundary, it's just a suggestion. Before we talk more about what my specific boundaries and practice policies are in my solo private practice, it's important to keep in mind that therapist boundaries and practice policies are going to look different depending on where your therapist works. Therapists working for themselves in solo private practice, therapists working for group practices, and therapists working in community mental health agencies are going to have access to different resources and are going to be influenced by different requirements. So for example, community mental health agencies often have access to administrative staff, billers, and case managers. And I want to be very clear, it is very well known that community mental health agencies often exploit therapists and burn therapists out. So in that regard, they have a lack of resources. They often don't pay their therapists well. Obviously, every situation is different, but in general, community mental health agencies do have a reputation for burning out their providers. So I want to make that very clear. That being said, when I worked in community mental health, we did have administrative staff, billers, and case managers. And because there was more staff available, there was sometimes more flexibility with the practice policies because there were people to support the clients while the therapists were seeing other clients. The setting that your therapist works in is going to be influenced by different requirements. When your therapist is operating out of a solo private practice and they're their own boss, there are typically less requirements. And now, of course, every setting is different. I am speaking generally, but there are typically less requirements, less systems that are dictating how the therapist has to operate. Of course, we still have to follow like federal law and state regulations, but if your therapist is operating from a group practice or a community mental health agency, they might be connected to grants, they might be connected to insurance systems, they might be certified as a specific clinic, and those systems might dictate the type of policies that those settings can have when working with clients. Now, earlier I mentioned informed consent, and I want to come back to that because that process is a very important part of engaging in therapy. Informed consent is the process of your therapist informing you of all of the practice policies, rights as a patient, the risks and benefits of engaging in therapy, all that good stuff, right? Everything you would need to know to make a sound decision about consenting to engage in therapy. And this is often all explicitly written out in paperwork that your therapist gives to you before you consent to having the first therapy session. And even though informed consent is a very important part of first engaging in therapy and making a sound decision consenting to engage in therapy, it is an ongoing process because as you continue to engage in therapy, there are going to be times where we are going to continue to reference the informed consent paperwork. We're going to continue to reference the risks and benefits of engaging in therapy, different interventions. We're going to reference the practice policies, your rights as a patient. So informed consent is very, very important in the beginning, and it is also an ongoing process while you engage in therapy. Now, in my solo therapy private practice, which I own and operate all by myself, I am a one-woman show, and I like it that way. Most of my policies are explicitly written out in all of my informed consent paperwork, and then I explicitly verbally discuss it with all new clients when we first meet for session, and I give them an opportunity to let me know if they have any questions or concerns or if I need to clarify anything for them. And of course, all of that is going to include like legal requirements, federal laws, state statutes, like stuff that I legally have to follow. Now, I say most of my policies are explicitly written because there are some boundaries that I have that might be client dependent, meaning that it's going to depend on each individual case. So for example, some clients who are coming to me to work through addiction and wanting to move towards sobriety, we might explicitly agree upon a boundary where when we meet for session, they cannot come to session under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And if they do come to session under the influence, we have to cancel that session. And I'll talk more about that later on, and I'll go into depth about what that will look like. But again, that is an example where that's not going to be something that's going to apply to every single client. It's going to be a boundary that we talk about when it comes up and when it is relevant. So now let's talk about my personal boundaries and practice policies in my solo therapy private practice. And I'm sure there's a lot more that I'm going to talk about, and there's absolutely boundaries and policies that apply to me, but I'm specifically talking about my boundaries and policies for my clients. Boundary number 1 is around completing the informed consent paperwork in order to first have our intake session. So when I have a phone consultation with a client and we agree that we want to work together and we want to schedule a session, what I will do is I will get them scheduled and then I will let them know I'm going to send them all of my informed consent paperwork for them to review and sign. And all of that paperwork needs to be reviewed and signed at least 48 hours in advance of our first session. And of course, they are welcome to reach out with any questions or concerns so that I can clarify anything and answer any questions so that they can make a sound decision when consenting to the therapy process. And if the paperwork is not reviewed and signed at least 48 hours in advance, I do have to cancel the appointment and we'll have to talk about rescheduling. I will say this is a rare occasion where I have to maintain that boundary. Usually what happens is if we get to the 48-hour mark and I notice that the paperwork is not complete, I'll reach out to them, I'll send them a text or an email and say, hey, I'm just reaching out because I see that the paperwork hasn't been completed yet. I just want to check in, see if you have any questions or concerns. And as a reminder, that paperwork does have to be completed before we have our first session. If you can complete it at least 24 hours before our appointment, we can still go ahead and meet. But if I see at that 24 hours mark the paperwork is still not done, I'm going to go ahead and have to cancel our session. And this is an important boundary in my therapy practice because one, I want to make sure that they know what they're consenting to when they decide to work with me. And we need to have that consent recorded because a rule of thumb in healthcare is if you don't document it, it didn't happen. And it's also important just for protecting my time and making sure that if I have space open, like if somebody needs to be seen, I can give that space to another client. The second boundary in my therapy practice is my attendance policy. I ask that if any client needs to cancel or reschedule, they give me at least 24 hours notice. They can call, text, email me, go into the client portal, cancel and reschedule themselves, whatever works for them. I'll have a timestamp on it, however they reach out. And if they give me that 24 hours notice, then there is no fee. They will not be charged for canceling the session or rescheduling. If there's less than 24 hours notice, or they no-show an appointment, I do charge my full session fee. And again, this is something that is explicitly written out in my informed consent paperwork. I explicitly talk about it in my very first session with my clients, so they know what they are agreeing to and they know what they are consenting to when they decide to work with me. I know some people can feel a little spicy when we talk about attendance policies and therapy, but they can have therapeutic benefits. I have had more than one client tell me that if I did not have an attendance policy and they could just late cancel without being charged, they would continue to avoid going to therapy when they know that they need to be there. And along with my attendance policy for my clients, I do also let them know that if I late cancel on them, like if I'm sick or something comes up and I have to give them less than 24 hours notice, then I give them a banked late cancellation. So if anything comes up for them in the future and they have to give me less than 24 hours notice to cancel a session, if they have that banked late cancellation, I'll waive the late fee. Boundary number 3 in my therapy practice, communication outside of therapy sessions. Now, I really have to take some ownership here. When I first started my practice, I did tell some of my clients, like, yeah, no problem. You can send me emails or texts outside of sessions. And as long as you know I'm not going to respond and we'll talk about it when we meet next, that's totally fine. I did tell people that, and then I got to a point in my career where I was like, oh wow, like this does not work for me. I am feeling really burnt out, and even though I'm not responding, it's almost like the sessions did not end. And so I had to take ownership and I had to communicate to all of my clients that moving forward, I could not have communication outside of therapy sessions. I informed them that the new boundary is that any communication outside of therapy sessions is for scheduling only. And I didn't write this down, but I'm realizing this is sort of connected to this boundary because I am the only person operating my private practice. I do not do crisis care. So if clients have emergencies outside of our sessions together, I let them know they can reach out, because if I am available, like maybe I have a free slot where I can see them and work with them, that's great. But I also tell them, like, don't wait for me to respond. I might not be working. I might be out of the office. I might be seeing other clients. So you can let me know that something's going on, but do not wait for me to respond. And then I clearly outline all of the emergency protocols that they can use when we are not working together. And that is just the nature of being a solo therapist in private practice. Like, I just cannot provide crisis care. I do not have the resources for that. Boundary number 4 in my therapy practice is that I do not see clients if they come to session under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Now, I mentioned this one earlier, so let's talk about it a little bit more in depth. Like I said, this is case dependent and is not going to apply to every single client that I work with. So it is not explicitly written out in my informed consent paperwork. However, what is explicitly written out in my informed consent paperwork is that your therapist might make recommendations or talk about different interventions with you to help you achieve your goals in treatment. Let's talk about how I navigate these situations. I will say these are more rare situations for me in my solo therapy practice because I primarily work with people who are processing trauma, which of course substance use is often intermingled with that, but I don't often actively work with people who are struggling with addiction where that is the primary concern. It's often that I am working with people who are wanting to process through trauma and they notice that one of their coping skills might be drinking a little bit too much or maybe using substances a little bit too much, but not when they're showing up for therapy. When I worked in community mental health, I did work with people who were more active in their addiction, and there were times where I had to have these conversations with clients. And like I said, this is really case dependent. So this is my general rule of thumb, and there might be times where I am more flexible with this boundary and it might make more sense for me to see clients even if they do come to session under the influence. So generally speaking, the rule of thumb is if a client comes to session under the influence of drugs or alcohol, I will not see them for that session. We will cancel the session and I will help them arrange a ride home if we're meeting in person, or if we're on a virtual session and I know that they are safe in their house, I know that maybe they have trusted support people in their home with them, I'll just remind them like, hey, we talked about this. We said we weren't going to meet if you're under the influence. So I know you're at home. I know your partner's home or your roommate's home or your friend or whoever their trusted person is. So I'm going to go ahead and hang up the session. I'll reach out to you tomorrow so that we can connect and talk about this and get you rescheduled. There might be times where a client shows up to session under the influence, but it might make more sense for me to do some harm reduction work with them and continue to engage with them in the session. And again, this is a very, very case-dependent scenario. It really depends on what I know about the client, what I know about their background, what I know about their support system, what I know about what we're working on together, what I know about how under the influence they are, what I know about any safety concerns, any protective factors. So I'm really considering a lot of things before I make the decision to follow my general rule of thumb. And the 5th and final boundary in my therapy private practice, or I should say the final boundary just for this YouTube video, is that I will not work with clients who create an unsafe environment for me as a therapist who is also a human. Let's talk about it. When you're a therapist or a healthcare worker in general, you are working with people who are often in very vulnerable positions. And as humans, myself included, when we are in vulnerable positions, we do not often act as our best selves. We are often acting out of place of survival. And survival sometimes looks ugly and sometimes it looks abusive. I am not saying that struggling with mental health or struggling with health issues excuses abusive behaviors. It is not an excuse. It will never be an excuse. So in my therapy private practice, I have a right to terminate treatment with any client if they become a physical threat to me or an emotional threat to me. And I can discharge them and give them referrals to work with somebody else. Abusive behaviors from clients can show up in a lot of different ways. And I want to be very clear, depending on the circumstances, I will often first try to work with a client through whatever is happening and create a repair with them and then hold the boundary of like, hey, this behavior is not okay. Yes, I'm your therapist, but I am not your punching bag. And let's talk about the boundaries moving forward. And if we can agree to that and commit to that and have a repair and create a safe environment for both of us to be able to support the client in moving towards their treatment plan goals, I will continue working with them. But if the abusive behavior continues, then like I said, I have the right to terminate treatment. I will say for that example, I'm speaking more about like emotional threats and emotional safety. If a client was ever creating an environment where I felt physically unsafe, I would terminate at that point. I would not continue working with them. And that is just not something I have the expertise, the competence to be able to navigate in a way that would support the client. And so it would not be a good environment for either of us. So these are some of the main boundaries in my therapy private practice, and this is what works for me. This is what creates a sustainable practice for me to continue doing the work that I want to do with my clients. If you're a therapist interested in solo private practice, I did create a step-by-step guide to creating your private practice, and I will link that below. It is also in my link tree, so you should check it out. It's got some great resources, and I talk a little bit more about what I was considering when I was building my private practice, and I also have some YouTube videos where I go over the step-by-step guide, so I'll link those below as well. If you like this video and you want to see more, please engage with my content. It helps me out a ton. Like, comment, subscribe, turn on that notification bell so you can get notified every time I post a video, and check out my other socials as well. Like I said, I'm on TikTok and Instagram at Therapy by Gabby, and I post a lot more consistently over there. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you at the next one.